BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? And yes, indeed, on Wednesdays I've been doing a regular segment about Jack the Ripper, and believe it or not, the Ripper suspect that I end up reading the most about is Dr. Alexander Pedachenko. And the reason why is because I did a previous episode on this channel called A Russian Jack the Ripper Suspect, where I was responding to a set of media articles where they talked about how a cane had been discovered in the records and archives that featured a composite carving, perhaps the only composite of Jack the Ripper, and it stated that it was of an individual named Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, and he could have been the person responsible for the Whitechapel murders, particularly the murders that took place from August 31st to November 9th of 1888, and as we will see very early on, he gets accused of other crimes. And the reason why I read up on Dr. Pedachenko so much is I was wondering, why aren't more people talking about him? Why isn't he pushed to the higher end of the suspect ratings? And he just seems to be something that isn't getting any real serious thought put into him as a Jack the Ripper suspect at all. And one more time, if you'd like to hear something that is very general, I invite you to listen to that episode, A Russian Jack the Ripper Suspect and Other Theories. And yes, I do a lot of comparing and contrasting between this one article that I was reading and some of the other Jack the Ripper suspects out there. But let's just go to another piece of fascination, and there's an article on casebook.org that talks a lot about the reasons why people don't think too highly of Dr. Alexander Pedachenko to introduce the suspect. Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, according to whichever variation of the story is told, Dr. Pedachenko used the alias Vasily Konovalov, and he also used the alias Count Andrei Luiskovo. He was sent by the Russian secret police to England to commit the Whitechapel murders in an attempt to discredit the Metropolitan Police, whom they believed were too soft on anarchist socialists and dissidents. His accomplices were Levitsky, who would have been the lookout, and Miss Winberg, who would engage with the prostitutes in conversation before Pedachenko struck. Pedachenko would have been Jack the Ripper in those scenarios. With their mission accomplished, Levitsky and Winberg were exiled to Yakutsk, Siberia, and Pedachenko was smuggled back to Russia, but he could not stop killing and murdered a woman in Petrograd before he was committed to an asylum. He was born in Tver, Russia in 1857 and worked in a local hospital. He was said to be a barber and surgeon who in 1888 was living in Walworth, South London, and he was described as having a curly waxed mustache and occasionally wore women's clothing. The original source of this story was William Lequeux, and yes, it's Lequeux, and perhaps I could call him William Lequeux, but I don't want to do the fake French accent, so I'll just call him William Lequeux, who claimed to have seen a copy of the January 1909 Okhrana Gazette, the bulletin of the Tsarist police, which advised all officers that Konovalov, his alias Alexander Pedachenko, had now died in the asylum. This is the other thing that really just sets me off about this story. There is no evidence that Pedachenko ever existed, nor that Konovalov and Pedachenko were the same person. The murder he supposedly committed in Petrograd in 1888 is unlikely, as it was not named Petrograd until 1914. Prior to that, it was called St. Petersburg. So many things to respond to, so many things to unpack from this particular post, as well as just talking about the King composite carving, excuse me, of Jack the Ripper. But before we go any further, I would like to remind you guys that a great way to support this channel is by hitting the like button, subscribing. It is a great way to contribute to all of these efforts. But another way to contribute is to go through some of the links in the description box, and you can also find one for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. And that allows you to make a donation to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Okay, first point, that I had heard a brief discussion about Vasily Konovalov on Martin Fido's program Murder After Midnight, which has been uploaded to YouTube for free, and that is that originally he would have gone from Russia to France. I mean, maybe there's some stops along the way. I would expect that there would have been extended stops, but he goes to France first and then into England. And we'll see very easily that this isn't the only theory that is blaming the Russians for Jack the Ripper, and it also goes to the fact that multiple witnesses or multiple people suspected that the crimes were not committed by someone who was English, but rather someone from Eastern Europe. I mean, Eastern Europe or Jewish. I mean, Aaron Kosminski is another very famous suspect who was a Polish Jew, and there's several other people whom I'm sure you can even think of immediately who were of Eastern European descent. If he had been born in 1857, then he would have been roughly 31 years old at the time of the Whitechapel crime, so that also seems to match up somewhat with a psychological profile put forward by Dr. John Douglas. And this theory also provides an explanation as to why the crime stopped. Well, he was working for the Russian secret police. He was sent to England to commit these crimes, to complete a mission, and he did so, and then he was smuggled back to Russia, so he was out of the country. That there is an explanation. That would also mean that anything that happened after that, any of the other accused crimes, such as perhaps the murder of Francis Coles, would not have been the responsibility or would not have been the work of Dr. Alexander Pedachenko if he were indeed Jack the Ripper. But let's look at some of these points. Firstly, I mean, I guess I have to just give a very strong challenge to this whole thing about how William LeCue says that he committed a murder in Russia, in the city of Petrograd, and prior to so let me just read that whole sentence again. The murder he supposedly committed in Petrograd in 1888 is unlikely, as it was not named Petrograd until 1914. Prior to that, it was called St. Petersburg. Now, William LeCue would have written that in 1923, so, okay, I mean, that's not, I mean, I think we can put two and two together. He would have been using the contemporary name, not the older name. But here's the more important point. When I just briefly looked into this guy, William LeCue, he was an Anglo-French writer, and he openly stated that he would have been reading this stuff in other languages. He would have been reading a lot about Dr. Alexander Pedachenko in French. So he's providing a translation of this and an interpretation of it in the English language. So, I mean, that could explain everything. I mean, that would just be the reason why he's using contemporary names and not the older names, because, well, he's translating and updating it and modifying it. I think you can get the idea. So that point, that absolutely does not hold any water at all, so says me anyway. But upon reading up a little bit more about this guy, William LeCue, who has written a book called Things That He Knows About the Kings and Crooks and so on, and that he has this type of theory involving Jack the Ripper and Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, upon brief inspection of this guy's work, he wrote like 150 books. He was a conspiracy theorist. Now, some people might call him an outright fraud, a liar, someone who's just making up weird ideas. No matter what you think about him, he was a conspiracy theorist. And that shows me that the foundation of this theory is really just that. It is a Jack the Ripper conspiracy theory. That, number one, the Russians were behind Jack the Ripper, as previously stated, to discredit the English police, and also to the Metropolitan Police because they were too soft on anarchists, socialists, and dissidents. Okay, I mean, that is an absolute conspiracy theory, because it's not based on any proven certifiable fact, and I'm sure even William LeCue would admit that. I mean, just reading some document that says so, well, that isn't proof of anything. I mean, number one, you'd have to verify the contents of that document. Number two, you'd have to take into account that even if someone genuinely did write that, could they have been lying? Number three, I mean, could there be some other type of explanation as to why said document existed? So many things. So just to jump to the conclusion that that's what happened, and we don't even necessarily know if what William LeQ's intentions were, but I mean, he's a conspiracy theorist, and not all conspiracies are easily substantiated. So the other point, though, that I would like to get to relates to the cane and that composite carving of Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, and that does appear to be the name that was placed on it when it was found in the records. That's why people were talking about it, that, oh, well, it must have been the top suspect, right? The explanations that were provided to the contrary is, number one, that is not Dr. Alexander Pedachenko in the cane composite. That is just a generic face. It was a novelty cane that was sold at the time of the murders, and like when people would come by the site, not exactly the time of the murders, but shortly thereafter. And it's not even a specific person. The second explanation, and this one is a little bit more interesting, is that that is not Dr. Alexander Pedachenko on the cane. It is instead a character from the book The Curse Upon Mitre Square. And when I was reading the first article about it, he was referred to as the Mad Monk character, and I think that's even featured in the article that's in The Sun. I mean, just citing the source. They're saying that's not Pedachenko, that is the Mad Monk character. The Curse Upon Mitre Square stands as the first book being written about Jack the Ripper, and it is available online for free. It can be downloaded, a PDF version, and I did just that because I thought the only way to truly get an answer about that would be to read the book itself. So I started doing that, and firstly, the Mad Monk character is actually named Bunk Martin, and in my copy I couldn't find an exact contemporary illustration of the character, but it's not too far-fetched because, firstly though, the one I read though, just to get to the heart and soul of this issue, it was about 59 pages long, one page was blank, and the first 12 pages are an essay that was written by Cindy Collins Smith, so really there are only about 46 pages that are talking about the curse upon Mitre Square, and then only the third part of it. There are three books in this mini booklet. That's what they're called, Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3. Only Book 3 even relates to Jack the Ripper, so very little information about Jack the Ripper. But as the title states, it is called The Curse Upon Mitre Square. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim of Jack the Ripper, was murdered in Mitre Square. So I didn't find too many things that I was looking for. But when I was reading the essay that was written by Cindy Collins Smith, she openly states that the book is a piece of pulpy trash. That's like the first sentence in the essay, and I was like, wow. But she really goes on to show how there was this contemporary belief at the time that was somewhat divided. Some people thought that Jack the Ripper was and not exactly an aristocrat. I mean, she didn't use that word, but I've used the word aristocrat in the past. I believe she said upperclassman. Some people thought that Jack the Ripper had to have been an upperclassman, say a doctor, if you will, even a medical doctor, maybe someone who was from a well-off society, a well-off part of society. And then people on the more working class side of London believe that Jack the Ripper had to have had some type of paranormal abilities, some type of phantom-like presence, and the reason for that was they just simply could not believe that there was any human out there who could actually murder people in this vicious way. And it even goes back prior to the murder of Polly Nichols, after the murder of Martha Tabram, who was not a confirmed Ripper victim. People held this belief that it just had to have been some type of paranormal entity that was committing the crimes, because they just didn't want to accept that humanity can be that vicious. And Cindy Collins Smith really showed us how literature can evolve in particular ways. And I mean, firstly, Alfred Hitchcock was inspired by Jack the Ripper to create one of his films, The Lodger, but also elements of Jack the Ripper are just present throughout his other things, like the entire concept of an unsolved mystery or about something that can hurt you and you don't necessarily know what it is. And the other serial killer that was very influential on Alfred Hitchcock was Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. And then by the time we get to the 1970s and the 1980s, we have films like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. And once you, I don't mean the first Friday the 13th, the ones after that, where you have these characters like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger, they are human-like, they have human features, but they have paranormal elements about them as well, because it's just this thing that humans have to constantly battle with when they recognize that there is this very destructive component of humanity. There's this very dangerous component of humanity, and I mean, this stuff happened at the time of Jack the Ripper. It happened in the 1970s and 80s, and it happens today. And people are absolutely terrified about the sinister nature of what other people can do. And when you take these elements of having a very vicious side of humanity partnered with some type of paranormal evil, then that is what creates an even more intense horror film. So that was the subject of the essay. And to be fair, I have talked about some of this before. Last year, actually, it might have been in 2021, I was reading something. I was reading a book called The Murder Stories that talked about how there's been a lot of evolution in this concept of was Jack the Ripper an aristocrat or upperclassman, or was Jack the Ripper a phantom or a spirit? And in the 1920s and 30s, it was very popular to depict Jack the Ripper as a ghost or a phantom in some way, and that was purely the choice of illustrators. She wasn't talking about any particular theory. The author of that book, as that is, but by the 1960s, illustrators have mostly settled on depicting Jack the Ripper as an aristocrat, like wearing the top hat and wearing somewhat formal clothing. So the evolution of Jack the Ripper in terms of the way that artists chose to portray the subject has been going back and forth, but it all goes back to that belief system from 1888 where there's this divide, it has to be some type of ghastly entity, or it has to be some type of very intelligent, well-educated person. And I don't even know if it would be fair to call Dr. Alexander Pedachenko an aristocrat, because we aren't even sure if he existed. That's why I ended up looking into him just thinking about him as a suspect, because, I mean, this guy is almost somewhat legendary, and I don't mean legendary in a good way. I mean legendary like when we're reading about an ancient civilization and a legendary dynasty, and there are these stories about how the civilization was formed, and did all that stuff really happen, or is it just a bit of, storytelling that is being substituted for real historical events? But I told you guys in some previous episodes that I really like the channel and website Jack the Ripper Tour. I did an episode last week talking about the Jack the Ripper suspect Francis Thompson, and I particularly enjoyed the interview that was done on Jack the Ripper Tour with Richard Patterson about his suspect, one more time, Francis Thompson. And the name of his book is Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. And I'm going to go over to jacktherippertour.com and look at the article that was written about Dr. Alexander Pedachenko. In 1923, William LeCue, who had covered the Whitechapel murders for the Globe newspaper as a journalist in 1888, published a book called Things I Know About King Celebrities and Crooks, in which he claimed to have found documents amongst the papers of the Russian monk Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, in which the identity of the perpetrator of the crimes was revealed. Of course, the newspapers were quick to publish the astonishing revelations that appeared to solve the mysterious Victorian crime spree once and for all. The Nottingham Evening Post was one such paper that published its claim on the 25th of October 1923, saying, Jack the Ripper disclosed at last, a mad emissary of the Russian police. And then, see, this is it. Storytelling as opposed to hard evidence. I mean, maybe if you have, these documents side by side and talking about some type of, experts all agree on the translation. But as I said, you have to verify the documents. Are these things really coming from Grigory Rasputin, of all people? In Mr. William LeCue's new book, Things I Know, there is an amazing story that a man discovered the original text of the Book of Ezekiel preserved at the Imperial Library at Petrograd, a cipher message that gave the whereabouts of King Solomon's concealed temple. But the most astonishing statement that William LeCue makes he does this in all seriousness, is that among the papers of the notorious Russian monk Rasputin, there's another monk, he had discovered the actual truth of the Jack the Ripper crimes. Rasputin wrote, the true author of these atrocities was disclosed by a Russian, well known in London, named Niederest. He was a spy of the secret police who was a member of the Jubilee Street Club, the anarchist center in the east of London. One night in the club, the identity of Jack the Ripper was revealed to him by a Russian anarchist named Nicholas Zveriev. The mysterious assassin was Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, who had been on the staff of the maternity hospital at Tver and lived on the second floor in Millionaya, and he had gone to London, where he lived with his sister in Westmoreland Road in Walworth. From there he sailed forth at night, took an omnibus across the London Bridge, and walked to Whitechapel, where he committed the secret crimes. Pedachenko had a female accomplice. According to Zveriev, whose record appears in the reports of the secret police, he was aided by the friend named Levitsky and his young tailoress called Winberg. The latter would approach the victim and hold her in conversation, and Levitsky kept watch out for the police. Levitsky, who had been born in London, wrote the warning postcard signed Jack the Ripper to the police and press. By warning postcards, of course, I think that means the Saucy Jackie postcard, but also the Dear Boss letter. It was through Levitsky that Zveriev knew the truth. The secret police were greatly amused. The report of Niederer's discovery amused our secret police greatly, for as that matter of fact, they knew the whole detail at the time, and had themselves actively aided and encouraged the crimes in order to exhibit the world of certain defects of the English police system. The records go on to state that Pedachenko was smuggled out of London by the secret police to Moscow. Okay, there must have been a better way to discredit the Metropolitan Police than committing 5 heinous murders in 1888. There must have been some alternative. A few months later, he was caught attempting the murder of a woman, and he was sent to an asylum where he died. That's the murder of the woman in Petrograd, also called St. Petersburg. And Levitsky was also exiled. And as we said previously, Levitsky and the woman were exiled to Siberia. But the quote about William LeQue is, William LeQue's new book states that the Jack the Ripper crimes that happened 35 years before its publication were the work of a Russian doctor named Alexander Pedachenko. So, what are you thinking about this? Firstly, I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I side with this being a hoax. I side with this story not being true. However, it is somewhat of a well-composed hoax. And I said very clearly, and I do stand by this point, that whole thing about how the murder couldn't possibly have taken place in the city of Petrograd because it wasn't called Petrograd until 1914, that is not acceptable because, I mean, how difficult would it have been for the writer to just update the name of the city to something more contemporary? And as I said, multiple languages are being used, and there is alterations that would take place during the translation, but that's still insufficient evidence. Now, was Dr. Alexander Pedachenko a real person? You think there would be more evidence or a more definitive statement if he were indeed a real person, but a lot of this just seems to come from somebody's wild storytelling, and there really isn't a lot of evidence to say that Pedachenko truly existed. And previously, it has been proposed that that's not even him in the Kane composite. So, if I had to make an ultimate determination right now, I would say that casebook.org got it right. There's no evidence that Alexander Pedachenko ever existed, and this maybe isn't someone who's lying to us, but someone who rushed to judgment and started believing something that wasn't true. I mean, the fact that Gregory Rasputin is involved, the Rasputin, wild storytelling, unsubstantiated storytelling, more importantly. But what do you think? What do you think about Dr. Alexander Pedachenko as a Jack the Ripper suspect? Number one, he would have been a doctor, had medical knowledge. Number two, there's a motive, even although I said it's a lousy motive, it's still a motive all the same for committing these crimes. Number three, there's an explanation about why the crime stopped. Number four, that could indeed be Dr. Alexander Pedachenko in the Kane composite. And number five, I mean, he would have also had accomplices who could have been involved with this. That's how he got away with it. And, I mean, I'm a little bit divided, but ultimately I've stated my case. If I had to side with anything, I would say that it's a hoax. But please, share your ideas in the comment section down below. What do you think about Jack the Ripper? Do you think the Russians were involved? And this is not the only theory that involves Russians, because I've also talked about Louis Deemschutz as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and this is the subject of Randy Williams' book, Sherlock Holmes, The Autumn of Terror, when he talks about how Russian anarchists also wanted to influence modern culture. And I did one episode talking about Louis Deemschutz as a suspect. The other one was called, this is almost like a part two, Did Jack the Ripper Change Modern Culture? And that gets more into some of Randy Williams's philosophical ideas and talking about how it's making a mockery of Christianity. And that stuff, I think, is just utterly fascinating. And I said previously in a different episode, I think that he was going down the right track with something, or he's on to something with that, about how certain dates in Ripper activity, August, not August, September 8th and September 30th, have certain meanings in the Orthodox Church. And like September 30th, for example, was the night of the Most Holy Theotokos, or the night of the Most Holy Mother of God, and that's why it was the double event. And I mean, if you can listen to that episode and you can hear the whole story, and also, of course, listen to Randy Williams on the Jack the Ripper Tour channel. He's done some other interviews as well. But he has a theory that involves Russians that are trying to send some type of message throughout the Western world. And this theory involving Dr. Alexander Pedachenko is somewhat similar. It is trying to make a mockery of the police, or trying to show flaws in the English police system. I've said it once, I've said it twice, I'll say it thrice. Was that really the best way to go about that? Send the mad Dr. Pedachenko there, who is so mentally unstable that he is even going to murder people in Russia? He's not some cold, methodical, and calculating assassin. Oh, no, he is. Okay, I take it back. He's a cold, methodical, and calculating assassin who is also completely insane if he murdered or attempted to murder another woman in St. Petersburg and then was sent to the asylum. I mean, as I said, I side with it being a hoax, but please share your ideas in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there was always BlackBoxNerd88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.